So thanks a lot, Jeff, and hello everyone. It's great to be here. AARP asked me to talk about early lessons and what promising workforce practices we could see from COVID-19. So what I thought I'd do was actually talk a little bit about the history of this issue and then fast forward to where we are today. So I'll talk about what's happening in the world of work and retirement. I'm going to talk about what's happened, what we know about older workers' experiences in previous economic downturns. I'm going to say a little bit about whether employers are becoming more age-friendly, drawing on some Australian data that I collected. I'm going to talk about how employers are responding during the recession. And we're going to also say a little bit about, talk a little bit about what's happened to older workers who've lost their jobs. So it's probably not news to most of you that a range of influential bodies such as the OECD and many others have been warning about the sustainability of social welfare systems and problems of labour supply on the back of ageing populations. And they've been saying that we need to encourage longer working lives. And governments internationally have been focused on this for decades now, really. And I think these messages are gradually filtering down to older workers themselves. They're as Phyllis Moen talks about, they're experiencing a different set of expectations and policies about working and retirement from those expectations that earlier generations tended to take for granted. And we know, looking back historically, that early retirement was once very strongly promoted by governments, by trade unions, by employers. But in the last, getting on 20 years or so now, or longer, that's been replaced very much by a pro-work agenda. So the whole focus has been on the prolongation of working lives. And we're seeing internationally a range of measures aimed at pushing out the final age of labour market withdrawal, the age of retirement. So we've seen over a long period now the closing off of early retirement pathways and the abolition of mandatory retirement. And I'll put up a table to illustrate this point in a moment, but it's clear that across the G20 countries, levels of older workers' participation have been increasing. But to point out, and I'll demonstrate this in a moment, this is albeit partly reflecting a cohort effect of increasing women's employment. So I'll show you in a moment that older women's labour force participation has been increasing dramatically, less so men's. I'll come back to this point in a moment. But talking about today, where we are now in terms of older workers' labour market situation, there is evidence from the US that the economic downturn has been disproportionately affecting older workers. And you'll see some work here from Bui, Butanand and Piachitti from April. So you see 15% of those aged 65 and over unemployment rate compared to approximately 13% of those aged 25 to 44. So some difference there regarding older workers, not a marked difference, but there certainly is some difference there. But if we look elsewhere, taking some research that's just been undertaken in the UK by Major and colleagues, they're finding that by contrast to that situation in the US, younger people are markedly more likely to have lost their jobs. But interestingly, in that research, there is some interesting findings around the spread of working 0 hours and some evidence of people aged 56 to 65 to be more likely to be working 0 hours at the moment. So some perhaps interesting differences to reflect on between different countries. So I refer to this table. This table shows labour force participation rates for people aged 55 to 64 in the G20 countries, excluding Saudi Arabia, because we don't have data for Saudi Arabia. And what this shows is rates of labour force participation in 5-year periods between 1980 and 2019. 2019 was the latest data I had. And I should say these data are OECD data. And so just to illustrate the points I'm just making, let's take the US as an example, then I'll speak about Australia briefly as another example. We see in 1980 for men a labour force participation rate of about 72%, and then that falling to around 67, 68% in 1985, and you can see by around about 1995 down to around 66%, but then a gradual increase to around 2019. But note that the participation rate in 2019 for men in that age group was still somewhat less than it had been in 1980. Look at the quite dramatic difference for women in the US, a labour force participation rate of around 41% in 1980. And then fast forwarding to 2019 with a participation rate of around 60%. It's even more dramatically illustrated if we look at Australia. That sort of downward trend in the 1980s is noticeable, and then the upward trend for men. But look at the situation for women in Australia, a participation rate of around 22% in 1980. But look at that, a dramatic increase to 61% in 2019. So this increasing participation of older workers is long-term increasing participation. Much of that has been due to increasing participation of older women. And I think that's a very important point to make. So things not so dramatic for men. And just to underline the point I made also, this early retirement that we saw in the late 1970s and 1980s is apparent here in terms of declining labour force participation, and participation has picked up subsequently. So let's move on. So it's important to, I think about this history of early retirement a little bit, because early retirement is often being portrayed as a matter of free choice. But in fact, the evidence from the 1970s and 1980s indicates that that's misunderstanding the situation. The issue for older workers in that period was that they tended to be overrepresented in industries suffering large declines in employment between 1975 and 1985. They were also more likely to be dismissed than younger workers, and if they lost a job, they were less likely to find employment subsequently. And also importantly, for organisations wishing to shed staff, it was relatively easy to negotiate early retirement. So this notion that early retirement is somehow voluntary, I think we should disabuse ourselves of that notion. I think it's far from the case. And this is a point I'm going to come back to in the latter couple of slides when I talk about early retirement today in Australia. So a little bit of the history of early retirement for you as a primer. A little bit more history, going back a little bit, and also drawing upon the recent Bui and colleagues study from the USA. They point out that during the global financial crisis, rates of unemployment amongst older workers in the US reached unprecedented levels. And they also, and it's a great paper, I would recommend people read it. They also underline what happens to older workers during recessions. So they're more likely to experience long-term unemployment, wage losses, years of reduced replacement earnings, loss of healthcare coverage, and utilization of healthcare on longevity. So the damage to older workers due to recessions is obvious, it's palpable. And former colleague of mine, Alan Walker, has pointed out that for many older workers experiencing long-term unemployment, this can in fact become a de facto kind of early retirement as people give up hope of ever working again. So this early retirement thing I'm going to be coming back to again in a few moments. So just a few comments on a study that I carried out a number of years ago now, but thinking about my presentation today, I was thinking, well, let's look at how employers view some of these issues. And I'm going to be referring to a study we carried out 10 years ago now in Australia, but I think you'll see why it's valuable to refer to a study from a few years ago. So this study involved a survey of 2,000 Australian employers, actually in the state of Queensland, of more than 50 employees. And we asked them a range of questions about the management of labour supply. And the study was called Working Late and the Spectre of Uselessness. So one set of questions we asked the employers was about responses to labour shortages. And I put this slide up here, and and you'll see it broken down in terms of for-profit organisations and government and not-for-profit organisations, and then larger and somewhat smaller employers. So the reason for putting this up is that there's often been a notion that employers are adverse to employing older workers. And I want to point out that in our study, that was not the case. So when we asked employers how they would respond to labour shortages going forward, you can see there that one of the key responses was actually around the recruitment of older employees. Another popular was offering greater job flexibility and also recruiting more women. But see older workers there. It's not necessarily the case that older labour is devalued by industry. I think far from it. And when we launched this study at the time, there was a huge amount of media interest because we've become used to the notion that employers were adverse to older workers, and I think I'm not so sure. But let's talk about another slide now from the same study. We also asked the employers about how they would approach reducing staff levels if we need to, and thinking about where we are today, some quite telling findings, I think. So in this study, and this is a few years ago now, we see a popular approach will be laying off temporary or contract workers, restructuring work. We're seeing laying off workers on performance grounds. We're seeing incentives for voluntary redundancies. Look at this popularity of early retirement for older workers, though. It's there for some organisations. It's relatively popular for government and not-for-profit organisations, but not so popular as other approaches. And so quite interesting, the story of the 80s, we're told, going into the 90s, was very much one of early retirement. But at least for these Australian employers a few years ago, early retirement did not seem to be such a popular option, at least compared to other measures. So I'll come back to this point again in a few moments. And so just very quickly, we did some further analysis of these data, and the question was actually around early retirement. What would you do if you needed to reduce staff levels by 20%? And that was actually the question they responded to. And so we saw that it was organisations with older workforces would be disposed to deploying early retirement, and also government for not-for-profit organisations, and also organisations who had problems recruiting particular occupational groups and labourers, I should say, specifically. So let's fast forward to where industry is sitting in this recession. And I did a small number of interviews in preparation for today's presentation. One with the managing director of a large international management consultancy, and her brief is the Asia Pacific region. And she had some very interesting things to say about where older workers were sitting presently. So the organisation, they tell me that they're seeing employers being much more intentional around supporting long tenure older workers when they're being impacted by change. So for instance, they're looking at internal redeployment opportunities before offering redundancy. When that's not an option, ensuring that in terms of allocating them to outplacement programs, allocation, I should say, is more aligned with life stage and tenure than seniority. So organisations are not just, the recourse is not just to older workers. She's saying there's a lot of thought going on in terms of approaching redundancy programs where they're considered necessary. So it's not just let's go for the workers with greater seniority. And inside their organisation, she tells me they've not seen an overrepresentation of older workers in the career transition programs that they run. So they offer outplacement services to organisations downsizing, and they're not seeing an overrepresentation of older workers on those programs. She told me as well that clients are trying to hang on to the most experienced staff to help see them through the hard times and out of the other side again. So it does seem that older workers are being valued by many organisations. And also she pointed to a focus on reskilling and upskilling to ensure workforce resilience and agility. So some quite positive messages there. Turning to her views of older workers themselves, and grounded in what she's being told by her own colleagues and also discussions with people participating in their outplacement programs. She tells me that older workers are thinking much more broadly in terms of their future options. They're not just thinking about their next job, but also considering things like gig work, contracts, and starting their own business. They're seeing high rates of job success and securing a new job from their program. So 70% seems like a good outcome to me. And a couple of anecdotes here. One of the coaches inside the organization telling her that they managed to land a position for a long tenure person from an IT company who was ready really to give up, but with support found a job in a relatively short period of time. And also an interesting an example of an HR director who'd been with a major international company for around 20 years. And in fact, I went on to speak with this person. We had a fascinating discussion about her experiences. She actually lost her job at the end of last year, and so has been looking for work in a very challenging environment. But what she's decided to do is launch her own consulting business as an experienced HR executive, supporting smaller businesses who can't afford to run their own HR resource, so they're outsourcing it. And she's finding quite a good niche for herself here. So the general message there, I think, is of success for older workers in quite challenging times. I'm going to hop over to another discussion I had with a representative of Diversity Council Australia, which is a business representative group around issues of diversity. And I asked her questions about where she saw older workers were sitting in the present labour market. And I think she made some quite telling comment. She said that she observes relatively little targeting of older workers directly. Instead, she sees much of the focus in industry being on women, on the young, Indigenous workers, those with a low socioeconomic status, and to a somewhat lesser extent, culturally and linguistically diverse workers. She sees primary responses in industry as being around increasing flexibility in terms of where one works, so working from home, for instance, and also increasing flexibility in terms of when one works, so reduced hours to avoid redundancies. And go back to those slides I showed you of that survey I did a few moments ago, reflecting on these comments. And I wasn't really surprised, based on that research we'd done a few years ago, to hear what my colleague at the Diversity Council had to say here. And also some quite interesting redeployment of Indigenous workers, overrepresented in hotels, moving over to work in a supermarket chain, one of our major leading supermarket chains, Coles. So interesting collaborations between employers going on there in terms of redeployment. But stressing that she's not observing much specifically targeting older workers. Of course, older workers would be involved in some of this, but she's not seeing specific activities around older workers. She did, though, point to quite an interesting exception, which was that the management consultancy EY, formerly Ernst & Young, I'm sure you all know, has recently, and this was announced in August in the Australian media, dropped a requirement for partners to retire at 60. So in the midst of a global recession, Ernst & Young decided that it was going to drop a requirement for its partners to leave at 60, which I think is really very interesting. So let's jump on a little bit and begin to conclude, because I wanted to sort of go back to this early retirement issue and say a little bit about what's happening in my neck of the woods, which is universities. And what we are seeing in Australia is a small number of organisations, but a growing number, not just public sector, private sector as well, but I'm going to talk specifically about public sector here. We're seeing early retirement being deployed in order to reduce headcount. So we're seeing 6 out of 40 Australian universities so far, and I think there's more to come, receiving approval from the Australian Tax Office to implement early retirement schemes. So in Australia, for an organisation to implement an early retirement scheme, the Australian Tax Office has to authorise it. So this is where my data are coming from. So it's an illustration of what universities are doing. And I should say that universities are being disproportionately impacted by the recession. Australian universities take huge numbers of students from overseas, and literally at the moment, students are not travelling. And Australian universities are hugely reliant on international students, and to a large extent, that flow of students has dried up. So Australian universities are under enormous pressure at the moment. And so some of them are resorting to early retirement schemes. And this one is, just to illustrate this, the University of South Australia has implemented a scheme targeting those aged over 55 on these grounds, and I'll read it to you. The university needs to ensure that its workforce profile supports reform of its products and services and the effectiveness of its new structure in an increasingly complex, competitive and globalised environment. It is for these reasons that the university has elected to implement the scheme to achieve these critical objectives. So what this is telling me, and I should say there are numerous other examples of this, that older workers are not viewed as being the future of these Australian universities. They're very much viewed as being, how to put it, out of time. So it's very interesting, I think, sort of contrasting, the management consultancy I was referring to a few moments ago, some sort of quite positive news perhaps with this. So just some concluding comments, and then I'll hand you back to Jeff. I think, in my view, given the data I've referred to from the US and UK earlier, I think it's too early to offer definitive statements regarding the emergence of policy supporting older workers during this time. I think it is really, really early days, and I think clearly regarding employer behaviour, the picture is a very mixed one. As I just said, there are some encouraging signs that longer tenured workers are being valued in organisations. And I think those of us who have been working this field a long time, I think it's heartening to see that employers are being very thoughtful around issues of retaining older workers. But we are also seeing programmes that are deliberately targeting older workers where job losses are retired. So these longer tenured workers aren't being valued in some cases. It's also interesting to see, I think, older workers themselves being willing to be flexible in terms of how they're viewing their employment futures. So taking on many of the messages, I think, around the need for continued labour force engagement, and older people thinking about their own skills and where they can fit into a changing labour market. So I hope you all found my presentation interesting. Thank you for your attention, and I'll hand you back to Jeff.